They said the old house by Troublesome Creek was already dying, just another broken place waiting for the river to claim it. But Margaret Whitaker stayed, raising her grandson Noah on almost nothing. One day she saw a starving stray dog locked in a trader's cage, wild-eyed and bound for slaughter. Everyone warned her to walk away. Instead, she sold the last keepsake from her dead husband, her silver earrings, and brought the animal home. Weeks later, Noah was struck by a deadly fever just as a summer flood swallowed the road, the house, and every hope of rescue. Trapped on a homemade raft, they faced black water, a venomous snake, and death itself. Until the dog everyone feared became the only reason they survived.
Before we begin, share the city you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if this kind of story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe and be part of the journey. Now, let's get into it.
The summer air over Troublesome Creek hung heavy with mud, wet grass, and thunder waiting behind the Appalachian hills, like an old god clearing his throat. Margaret Maggie Whitaker had lived 71 years without ever owning much more than what she could carry in both hands. And lately, even that felt generous. She was a small, narrow-shouldered woman, with pale, weather-thinned skin, silver hair pinned in a loose knot, and blue eyes faded not by weakness, but by having watched too many people leave. Her cotton dresses were always mended at the elbows, her shoes polished only by rainwater, and her hands had the permanent bend of a woman who had scrubbed floors, planted beans, buried a husband, and still risen before dawn, because sorrow, like chickens, expected feeding. Folks in Breathitt County called her stubborn, though Maggie preferred the word remaining. Stubborn sounded like a mule. Remaining sounded almost holy. Her husband, Thomas Whitaker, had died 12 years earlier, leaving behind a leaning wooden house in the low ground near Troublesome Creek, a rusty pickup that no longer started, and a pair of silver earrings he had bought her when they were young enough to believe poverty was temporary. Their only daughter had passed young, and her grandson, Noah Carter, had come to live with her after that, bringing with him a suitcase, 2 comic books, and a silence too large for a child. Noah was 10, thin as a willow switch, with warm brown skin from summer sun, soft black curls that refused every comb Maggie owned, and dark, watchful eyes that seemed older whenever he thought no one was looking. He had his mother's kindness, and his grandmother's talent for pretending hunger was simply not being in the mood. On good days, he laughed like a creek over stones. On bad days, he sat by the window and listened for roads that never brought anyone back. That Thursday afternoon, Maggie walked into the small market near Jackson because Noah needed cornmeal, fever medicine, and something sweet if she could stretch the coins far enough. The sky was a bruised purple over the hills, but summer storms were common there, dramatic as church ladies and twice as loud. Outside the market, beside the gas pumps, an old white truck stood with cages stacked in the bed. 2 men leaned against it, chewing tobacco and talking low. One was Travis Pike, a heavy man in his 40s, with a red neck, a shaved head, and a beard like wire wool. He had the lazy grin of someone who had learned that cruelty often passed for business if he said it confidently. The other, Earl Madsen, was thinner, gray-faced, and twitchy, with a cigarette trembling between yellowed fingers, and eyes that slipped away whenever they met another person's. Inside the lowest cage, pressed against rusted bars, crouched a dog so thin Maggie first mistook him for a shadow with teeth. His coat was a muddy reddish brown, patchy along the ribs, with old scars crossing one shoulder and ears torn uneven at the tips. He could not have been more than 3 or 4 years old, though hardship had aged him into something ancient. His amber eyes burned from a narrow skull, not with evil, but with the terrible panic of a creature who had been taught that every approaching hand carried pain. When a boy from the market stepped too close, the dog lunged against the cage, snarling so fiercely the metal rattled. The boy yelped and ran. Travis laughed. "Mean devil, ain't he? Nobody wants that one except the buyer down south. He'll be gone before dark." Maggie stopped so suddenly her basket knocked against her knee. There were some words people used to make death sound tidy. Buyer was one of them. Gone was another. The dog stared at her, lips curled back, ribs flashing beneath his skin like the hoops of a broken barrel. A sensible woman would have walked on. Maggie had been sensible most of her life, and it had rewarded her with unpaid bills, cold winters, and an empty chair across the table. "How much?" she asked. Travis looked her up and down, taking in the faded dress, the worn handbag, the poverty plain as dust on her shoes. "More than you got, ma'am." His tone made Earl snicker. Maggie's cheeks warmed, but she did not move. In the cage, the dog growled again, low and thunderous, as if warning her not to become kind. Kindness, he seemed to know, could be another trap. Maggie thought of Thomas placing the silver earrings in her palm 48 years earlier, his young face shy beneath dark hair, his jaw clean-shaven then, his smile crooked with hope. She had worn them to church, to funerals, to their daughter's wedding, and on the night Noah first arrived because she had wanted the child to believe someone in that house still knew how to shine. Those earrings were not jewelry anymore. They were memory made metal. They were proof that once, before sickness and loss and silence, someone had looked at Maggie Whitaker as if she were a queen instead of a woman counting pennies under a dim kitchen light. She went to Harlan's Pawn 2 doors down, where old Mrs. Harlan, a round, soft-spoken widow with coffee-colored skin, careful gray curls, and spectacles that rode low on her nose, weighed the earrings in her palm and understood, too quickly. "Maggie," she said gently, "are you sure?" Maggie looked through the pawnshop window at the truck, the cages, the dog hunched like a fallen soldier refusing to die. "No," she answered, "but I'm doing it anyway." When she returned with the money, Travis's grin faded into surprise. He took the bills, unlocked the cage, and dragged the dog out with a rope looped tight around his neck. The animal snapped, twisted, and nearly caught Earl's boot, earning a curse and a kick that Maggie blocked with her own thin leg before she had time to think. Pain shot up her shin, but she stood firm, small as she was, her face suddenly stern enough to make both men pause. "He's mine now," she said. "You don't touch him again." Bringing him home was less a rescue than a slow parade of mutual suspicion. The dog rode in the back of a neighbor's borrowed truck, crouched low, trembling and growling at every bump in the road. Noah waited on the porch when Maggie arrived. He took one look at the creature and whispered, "Grandma, that is not a dog. That is a broom that learned how to bite." Maggie almost laughed, and the sound surprised her. It rose from somewhere she thought had been boarded shut. "Then we'll call him Rusty," she said, because his coat was red-brown beneath the filth, and because rust, like grief, meant something had survived weather. Rusty snapped when Noah stepped down from the porch, so Maggie held out one arm. "Slow," she warned. Noah, being 10 and therefore half angel, half raccoon, obeyed only halfway. He fetched an old metal bowl, filled it from the kitchen pump, and placed it at the edge of the yard before backing away with exaggerated dignity. Rusty stared at the bowl, then at Noah, then at Maggie. His body remained tight as a drawn bow, but thirst was older than fear. At last he crept forward, lowered his scarred head, and drank. Maggie stood in the damp heat with her empty earlobes aching in a way that felt almost like prayer. She had sold the last bright thing from her past to buy a snarling, half-starved animal no one believed could love. Yet as Rusty drank, Noah watched him with solemn hope and the first drops of rain began tapping the porch roof, soft as fingers asking permission to enter. Rusty spent his first night beneath Maggie Whitaker's porch, curled in the dirt like a curse someone had forgotten to finish. He did not sleep so much as guard his own exhaustion, one amber eye opening at every creak of the house, every owl call, every soft shift of Noah's feet above the floorboards. By morning, the summer rain had passed, leaving Troublesome Creek swollen but calm, and the yard smelled of wet clay, green weeds, and old wood. Maggie, 71 years old and thin as a candle burned too long, stepped onto the porch with a chipped bowl of cornmeal mush and scraps of fatback. Her silver hair had escaped its pins in soft wisps around her weather-lined face, and her blue eyes looked tired, but not afraid. She set the bowl at the bottom step and spoke as if addressing a wounded king in a ruined temple. "No debt between us, Rusty. Eat if you want." From under the porch came a growl low enough to make the boards tremble. Rusty was a ragged reddish-brown dog of 3 or 4 years, all ribs, scars, torn ears, and suspicion. Hunger pulled him forward. Terror pushed him back. At last he lunged, seized the bowl in his teeth, dragged it into the shadows, and ate so fiercely that Maggie wondered how long the poor creature had been surviving on garbage and anger. Noah Carter watched from behind the screen door. At 10 years old, he was narrow-shouldered, dark-eyed, and solemn in the way children become when they have learned grief before multiplication. His black curls stuck out like storm-tossed grass. "He stole the bowl," Noah whispered. "No," Maggie said. "He negotiated ownership." That made Noah grin, and the house, which had held so much silence, seemed to remember for 1 second that laughter was allowed. The next days became a slow ceremony of patience. Rusty refused the kitchen, refused the porch, refused hands, refused kindness with the pride of a tiny, starving war god. He slept beneath the steps, tore apart an old burlap sack Maggie had offered as bedding, and once attacked his own reflection in a washpan with such offended fury that Noah nearly fell backward laughing. "He thinks there's another ugly dog in there," Noah said. Maggie gave him a look. "Mind your manners. That ugly dog might be family." Rusty snapped at the broom, growled at thunder, and barked himself hoarse at a scarecrow in the bean patch until Maggie finally told the scarecrow, "You heard him, Clarence. Stop acting suspicious." Yet she never raised a hand, never cornered him, never tried to force gratitude from him, like squeezing water from stone. Each morning she placed food a little closer to the porch steps. Each evening she sat in her rocking chair with her swollen ankles wrapped in a towel and spoke to him about ordinary things. The price of flour, the cruelty of mosquitoes, the way Thomas had once tried to fix the roof and nearly baptized himself in the rain barrel. Rusty listened from the shadows, ears pricked, body tense, as if her voice were a language from a country he had been banished from long ago. Noah had his own method. He brought books outside and sat under the hickory tree, keeping a respectful distance. The hickory was old, broad-limbed, and stubborn, much like Maggie, its leaves whispering over the yard like green hands blessing the poor. Noah read aloud from worn adventure stories, stumbling over hard words, but giving every pirate, knight, and dragon a voice. Rusty did not appear impressed. Whenever Noah gave a villain a dramatic accent, the dog flattened his ears as though deeply offended by theater. Still, he stayed. Day by day, he crept from beneath the porch to the yard, then from the yard to the shade of the hickory, always close enough to flee, always far enough to pretend he had not chosen company. Maggie noticed everything. She noticed how Rusty stopped baring his teeth when she brought water. She noticed how his growl shortened from a threat to a warning, then from a warning to a habit. She noticed how his eyes followed Noah, especially when the boy coughed. Noah had always been delicate after summer colds, his chest too quick to tighten, his face too quick to pale, and Maggie carried that fear in a locked room of her heart. Rusty seemed to hear what adults tried to hide. Once, when Noah bent over coughing beside the bean rows, Rusty stood up so abruptly, the old sack dragged behind him like a defeated flag. He did not approach, but his ears lifted, his scarred head tilted, and a confused worry crossed his wild face. "I'm fine," Noah told him. Rusty snorted, unconvinced. From then on, the dog followed the boy at a distance whenever he went to the garden. If Noah pulled weeds, Rusty lay beneath the hickory. If Noah carried water, Rusty walked along the fence line, pretending to inspect kingdom borders. If Noah sat down to rest, Rusty sat too. He still would not allow touch, but he began accepting presence. For a creature like him, that was a miracle with muddy paws. One afternoon, Maggie brought out a piece of cornbread and held it low without looking directly at him. Her hand was knotted with age, blue veins raised under thin skin, the same hand that had sold its last silver memory for his life. Rusty stared at her fingers. The yard held its breath. Even the cicadas seemed to hush, as if Olympus itself had leaned over the Kentucky hills to watch. Slowly, trembling with distrust and longing, Rusty stepped forward. His nose brushed her fingertips. Maggie felt the warmth of his breath, quick and uncertain. He took the cornbread, not gently, but not cruelly either, and backed away. Noah clapped once before catching himself. Rusty flinched, then glared at him with royal disgust. "Sorry," Noah whispered. "Your Majesty." Maggie laughed softly, but tears had gathered in her eyes before she could stop them. She had not rescued Rusty because she expected repayment. She had rescued him because something in his cage had looked like her own heart after Thomas died, after her daughter was buried, after Noah came home carrying more sorrow than toys. A heart could snarl when it had been kicked enough. A heart could bite when every hand had once meant loss. That evening, Rusty climbed the porch steps for the first time. He did not enter the house. He simply lay beside the door, ribs rising and falling, one torn ear pointed toward Noah's room. Maggie sat nearby in the dusk, listening to frogs call from the creek bottom and watching fireflies blink over the weeds like tiny lanterns sent by forgiving angels. She understood then that saving Rusty had stopped being charity. It had become a question placed before her by heaven, or fate, or the old green gods of the hills. Could love, patient and foolish and slightly underfunded, teach a broken creature the road back home? Rusty sighed in his sleep, and for the first time, he did not wake himself with fear. By mid-July, the heat over Troublesome Creek had grown thick and breathless, and the hills stood silent beneath a sky the color of bruised tin. Noah Carter first complained of being tired just after breakfast, which might have meant nothing on any other summer morning. He was 10, thin, restless, and often too proud to admit when his small body had spent more strength than it owned. Maggie Whitaker found him sitting on the porch step with one hand pressed against his forehead, his black curls damp against his temples, his brown eyes dull where they were usually bright with questions. Rusty lay nearby under the hickory tree, the reddish-brown stray no longer hiding beneath the porch, but still pretending every act of loyalty was merely professional supervision. When Noah coughed, Rusty lifted his scarred head. When Noah shivered, the dog stood. Maggie saw both things, and fear moved inside her ribs like a bird trapped in a chimney. "You come inside now," she said, keeping her voice calm, because old women, like saints and liars, learned early that fear must not be fed in front of children. Noah tried to smile. "I'm just hot, Grandma." But his hands were cold. By noon, his fever had climbed so fiercely that the air around him seemed to tremble. His lips dried and cracked. A rash like scattered red pinpricks appeared along his arms. He complained that his bones hurt, not in the dramatic way children complained about chores, but in a thin, frightened whisper that made Maggie remember hospital corridors, unpaid bills, and her daughter's last winter. She laid cool cloths across his forehead, prayed in fragments, and called the county clinic with fingers that shook against the old landline phone. The doctor who answered was Dr. Elaine Mercer, a woman in her early 50s with a low, steady voice, silver blonde hair always cut short for practicality, and the blunt kindness of someone who had spent 25 years telling poor families hard truths without making them feel small. Maggie had met her twice before at the clinic in Jackson. Dr. Mercer was tall, spare, and sharp-eyed behind thin glasses, the kind of woman who remembered names, symptoms, and which patients pretended they had eaten when they had not. Years of rural medicine had made her patient with panic but unforgiving toward delay. As Maggie described Noah's fever, rash, dizziness, and the way he winced when light touched his eyes, the line went quiet for one terrible second. "Maggie," Dr. Mercer said at last, "listen carefully. This could be a severe mosquito-borne fever. I don't want to frighten you, but Noah needs the hospital tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." Maggie looked through the kitchen window. Outside, the hills had vanished behind a wall of rain. It had begun without warning, not as a shower, but as a tearing open of heaven, as if some storm giant had split the clouds with both hands. "The road's already bad," Maggie said. "Then call for help before it gets worse," Dr. Mercer replied. "Keep him hydrated. Keep him awake if you can. If he becomes confused, if he bleeds, if his breathing changes, you call emergency services again and again until someone answers." The connection crackled. Maggie heard distant thunder, then the doctor's voice. Softer now. "Do not wait." The line died. A minute later, the lights blinked once, twice, then vanished. The refrigerator fell silent. The little house, already poor and leaning, seemed suddenly older than the century, like a wooden ark abandoned before the flood. Maggie stood in the dim kitchen with the phone in her hand and felt the world narrow to Noah's shallow breathing from the bedroom. Rusty paced at her heels, claws clicking on the boards, his torn ears pinned back. He had been beaten by men, trapped in cages, starved into rage. Yet this was the first time Maggie saw him afraid of something he could not bite. She went to the window again. Troublesome Creek, usually a brown ribbon beyond the field, had swollen into a black, roaring body. It surged through the low ground, carrying branches, bottles, and pieces of someone's fence. The dirt road was gone. Not flooded, not muddy, but gone. Swallowed beneath a current that moved with the blind hunger of a mythic river demanding tribute. Maggie tried the phone again. Nothing. She tried the small radio Thomas had once kept for storms, but it gave only static, a swarm of angry bees. Noah called for her then, and the sound cut through her. He was half sitting in bed, eyes unfocused, skin pale beneath the fever flush. "Grandma," he whispered, "why is the floor moving?" It was not the fever. Water had reached the house. The first wave struck the porch hard enough to shake the walls. Rusty barked once, deep and savage, then ran to Noah's room and planted himself beside the bed. Maggie moved with the speed of a woman who had been old yesterday, but had no permission to be old today. Behind the house, under a tarp, lay broken things she had never thrown away because poverty teaches resurrection. 2 blue plastic barrels, a warped closet door, old fence boards, and rope from Thomas's dead pickup. She dragged them into the rising water, rain lashing her face, her thin arms burning. Each knot she tied felt like a bargain made with God. 1 more minute, 1 more breath, 1 more chance. Rusty followed, whining, then seized the rope in his teeth, as if he understood the assignment better than any angel. Together, woman and dog pulled the crude raft against the porch while the creek climbed the steps. Maggie wrapped Noah in a quilt, lifted him with a strength born from terror, and half carried, half dragged him through the rain. He was light in her arms, too light, a little prince of fever whose kingdom had become water. "Stay with me," she told him. "You hear? You stay with me." Noah's head rolled against her shoulder. "Rusty coming?" "Rusty wouldn't miss the chance to be dramatic," Maggie said, though her voice broke on the last word. The dog leapt onto the raft before she had finished speaking, slipped once on the wet boards, then crawled beside Noah and pressed his narrow body against the boy's legs. Another wave slammed the porch. The old house groaned behind them, boards popping like bones. Maggie pushed off with a broken broom handle. For 1 suspended second, the raft hesitated, caught between home and the dark, open water. Then the current took them. They spun away from the porch, past the hickory tree, whose roots disappeared beneath the flood, past the kitchen window where Maggie's life had once been small, hungry, and bearable. The house tilted behind them in the rain, its porch sagging, its walls shuddering under the blows of the water like a tired guardian failing at last. Maggie gripped the rope around the barrels until it cut her palms. Noah burned under the quilt. Rusty trembled, but did not leave him. Around them, the black flood roared through the summer night, and their little raft drifted into darkness, fragile as a prayer thrown into the mouth of a storm. The raft drifted through the flooded dark like a splinter of wood stolen from a broken ark, while summer rain hammered the black water into 1,000 silver wounds. Maggie Whitaker had no strength left for fear, which was different from courage and much less glorious. Courage, she thought, belonged to young soldiers, saints in stained glass, and fools who had not yet learned what the world could take. What she had was older and uglier, the stubborn refusal to let go of the child burning beneath the quilt at her knees. Her thin hands, raw where the rope had cut them, clutched the raft's side as the homemade thing spun between drowned fence posts and floating branches. Noah Carter lay curled against the warped closet door that formed the raft's middle, his face pale beneath the fever, his black curls plastered to his forehead, his lips moving around words too soft to understand. Beside him, Rusty trembled so hard that rainwater shook from his reddish-brown coat in quick shivers. He was still too thin, still scarred, still one bad memory away from becoming teeth and panic again. But his narrow body stayed pressed against Noah's legs, as if the boy were the last warm coal in a dying world. The flood carried them into a snarl of debris where fallen limbs, plastic buckets, roof shingles, and thorny brush had jammed against the remains of a cattle fence. The raft struck hard. Maggie cried out as Noah slid sideways and Rusty lunged, catching the quilt in his teeth, dragging the boy back from the edge with a desperate, muffled growl. "Good boy," Maggie whispered, though the words nearly drowned beneath the water. "Good, brave boy." Then something moved among the branches. At first, Maggie thought it was a rope, slick and dark, looping over a broken plank. But the shape lifted its head, and lightning revealed the pale diamond pattern along its thick body. A copperhead, driven from its hole by the flood, writhed onto a floating board not 3 feet from Noah's bare hand. Its head flattened, its body coiled. The rain blurred everything except its eyes, cold and ancient, like 2 drops of venom borrowed from some underworld river. Maggie tried to reach for the broom handle she had used as a pole, but it had slipped away minutes before. Her arms shook uselessly. "No," she breathed. It was not a command. It was a prayer without enough breath behind it. The snake struck toward the raft. Rusty exploded forward. Gone was the half-starved stray who had hidden beneath the porch. Gone was the wounded creature who flinched from raised hands and growled at kindness. In that instant, he became something older than fear, a ragged guardian with torn ears, ribs like bow hoops, and a heart that had finally chosen where it belonged. He planted himself between Noah and the snake, paws spread wide on the slick wood, fur bristling along his spine. His bark cracked through the storm so violently that Maggie felt it in her chest. The snake recoiled, then lunged again. Rusty snapped at the air beside it, not close enough to be bitten in the face, but close enough to draw its fury. The copperhead struck low. Rusty jerked back, yet one fang or broken branch sliced along his front leg. Blood darkened the wet fur. He did not retreat. He barked again and again, each sound a thrown stone against death. The snake twisted, lost balance on the rocking plank, and slid into the rushing water. For one terrible second, its body whipped against the raft's edge. Then the current seized it and dragged it away into the black. Maggie sobbed once, short and broken. Rusty stood panting, injured leg lifted, eyes blazing. Noah's eyelids fluttered. "Rusty," he murmured. The dog turned at once, limped back, and pressed his wet muzzle under the boy's hand. But Noah's fingers did not curl around him. His breathing had become faint, thin as a thread pulled too far from the cloth. Maggie lowered her ear to his mouth and felt only the smallest warmth. "Stay," she said. But this time she was not sure whether she spoke to Noah, Rusty, God, or the river itself. Far away, beneath the roar of floodwater, Rusty heard something Maggie could not. His ears lifted. His head turned downstream, then upstream, nose cutting through rain and mud and gasoline stink. At first, Maggie thought he was listening to thunder. Then, faintly, impossibly, she heard it too. A siren, broken by distance and water, crying somewhere beyond the drowned road. Rusty whined. He looked at Noah. He looked at Maggie. The choice passed through him like lightning through a tree. "No," Maggie whispered, understanding before he moved. "Rusty, no." But love, once it had awakened in that battered body, had no talent for obedience. Rusty stepped to the raft's edge. His injured leg trembled. Debris spun past. Tin roofing, wire, branches, a white cooler turning over and over like a ghostly head. No thin dog should have entered that water. No creature made of scars and hunger should have challenged a flood that had already swallowed roads, fields, and homes. Rusty leapt anyway. The current took him under at once. Maggie screamed his name, a raw sound torn from the pit of her. He surfaced several yards away, coughing, paws clawing at the brown-black water. A sheet of tin spun toward him. He twisted aside. A coil of fencing wire dragged across his shoulder. He yelped, vanished, then burst up again, fighting forward with the savage rhythm of something too loved to die quietly. He swam toward the siren. The world became water, thunder, and the small red-brown head appearing, disappearing, appearing again. On the broken county road, half a mile away, two rescuers stood beside an inflatable boat caught against a submerged guardrail. Deputy Lucas Reed was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s with dark brown skin, a square jaw, close-cropped black hair, and a trimmed beard sharpened by rainwater. He had a steady, grounded manner shaped by years of pulling neighbors from wrecks and floods, though a childhood memory of losing his father in a river accident made his calm feel carved from pain rather than ease. Beside him was Hannah Cole, a volunteer rescue medic of 28, tall and wiry, with freckled fair skin, auburn hair braided tight beneath a yellow rain hood, and gray eyes quick enough to notice both danger and hope before others did. She had the brisk kindness of someone who joked only after the bleeding stopped. Rusty reached them half dead with effort, slammed his paws against the boat's side, and barked until his voice cracked. "That dog's trying to tell us something," Hannah shouted. Lucas stared at the animal, then at the flood behind him. "Or he's filing a complaint about the weather." But when Rusty plunged back into the water, then turned to see if they followed, the humor vanished from Lucas's face. They shoved the boat free. Rusty swam ahead, circling whenever the current pulled him off course, barking, vanishing behind debris, reappearing like a muddy little herald sent by some river god who had changed sides. At last, through rain and branches, Hannah's flashlight caught the shape of Maggie's raft. Maggie lifted one bleeding hand. Noah lay motionless beneath the quilt. Rusty reached the raft first, dragged himself onto the boards, and collapsed beside the boy. Still facing the approaching boat, as if guarding the miracle he had delivered, the rescue boat reached the raft just before dawn, when the floodwater had turned gray, and the broken house behind them looked like a tired beast sinking back into the earth. Lucas Reed grabbed the raft first, his broad shoulders straining beneath his soaked rescue jacket, rain running through his trimmed beard as he shouted for Hannah Cole to take Noah. Hannah, wiry and sharp-eyed under her yellow hood, moved with the fierce gentleness of someone who had learned that panic-wasted seconds and seconds could become graves. The homemade raft split as soon as her boots touched it. One blue barrel tore loose. The warped closet door cracked down the middle, and for one awful breath, Maggie thought the river had only waited until hope arrived before making its final demand. But Lucas caught her by the arm, Hannah pulled Noah against her chest, and Rusty, half collapsed beside the boy, snapped weakly at Lucas's sleeve as if to say that rescue was appreciated, but still under review. "Fair enough, little man," Lucas muttered, hauling the dog in too. "You save everybody and still file a complaint." Maggie would have laughed if her heart had not been trying to crawl out of her ribs. Noah was rushed to Breathitt County Medical Center, a low brick hospital on higher ground, where the fluorescent lights seemed too bright after the river's black mouth. Dr. Samuel Brooks met them in the emergency room, a lean man in his late 40s, with deep brown skin, tired hazel eyes, close-cropped black hair, and a neatly trimmed beard that could not hide how often he had slept in hospital chairs. He had the careful voice of a man who had lost a younger sister to untreated illness in childhood, and that old wound had made him gentle with frightened families, but merciless with anything that delayed care. Beside him, Nurse Linda Mae Fletcher, a broad-hipped woman in her 60s, with rosy cheeks, steel gray hair in a bun, and the brisk tenderness of a grandmother who believed soup could cure grief, but IV fluids should come first, wrapped Maggie in a blanket before Maggie even realized she was shaking. Noah was placed under monitors, given fluids, medicine, and blood tests that seemed to steal color from Maggie's world one tube at a time. For 3 days, the boy drifted between fever and sleep. Maggie sat beside him in borrowed clothes, her face hollow with exhaustion, her hands folded as if holding an invisible rosary. Rusty was treated in the animal intake tent outside the emergency shelter, his front leg cleaned and bandaged by Hannah, with a seriousness that made him look faintly offended. He refused food unless Maggie brought it. He refused sleep unless he could see the hospital doors.
Come on, boy, you can
Every
do it.
time someone wheeled a cart past, he raised his head, amber eyes searching for Noah, as though the boy's scent was the only star left in his sky. On the 4th morning, Noah opened his eyes fully. His lips were pale, his curls flattened, and his voice was no stronger than a moth wing. "Grandma?" Maggie bent over him so quickly her chair scraped the floor. "I'm here." His gaze wandered toward the window. "Rusty?" Nurse Linda Mae, who had already been bribing hospital rules with the confidence of a minor rural queen, smiled. "That heroic scarecrow is outside terrorizing a sandwich wrapper. I'll see what can be arranged." By afternoon, Noah was stable enough for Maggie to step outside the emergency shelter, where displaced families sat beneath tents, wrapped in donated blankets, speaking softly about homes, roads, cattle, photographs, and all the small kingdoms the flood had carried away. The sky had cleared to a washed summer blue, innocent as if it had not recently tried to drown half the county. Rusty lay under a folding table, muddy, bandaged, and suspicious of compliments. Maggie filled a plastic basin with clean water from a relief station and knelt beside him. "Come here, you ridiculous miracle," she whispered. Rusty thumped his tail once, pretending it had been an accident. She began washing him slowly, wiping river mud from his ribs, his torn ears, his narrow face, and the scarred shoulder that spoke of years no one had loved him properly. Dark water ran into the grass. Beneath the filth, the reddish-brown coat showed warmer, almost copper in the sun. Then Maggie lifted his injured paw to clean between the toes, and her breath stopped. One nail on his left front paw was crooked, bent slightly inward from birth or old injury. Not broken, not fresh. A little wrong in a way she had seen before. Her hand trembled. Rusty watched her, uncertain. Maggie pushed wet fur aside at the back of his neck. There, hidden beneath mud and matted hair, was a small white patch shaped like a crescent moon. The world went silent. Not quiet. Silent, as if the creek, the tents, the hospital, even the angels had leaned in. Maggie saw another dog, decades earlier. A red-brown hound mix named Copper, with the same crooked nail and the same moon-shaped mark behind his neck. Copper had belonged to her son, Daniel Whitaker, a tall, restless young man with Thomas's square jaw, Maggie's blue eyes, dark, wavy hair, and a smile that always arrived a little sideways. Daniel had been tender with animals and impatient with people, a boy-turned-man who carried too much pride after his father's illness and too much anger after years of poverty pressing against him like a locked door. When he left home at 22, he took Copper with him in an old green car, promising to call once he found steady work. He never did. Months became years. Years hardened into a grief Maggie could not bury, because no body, no letter, no goodbye had ever given it permission to rest. Now she stared at Rusty's crescent mark and understood with a force that nearly knocked her backward. Rusty was not Copper. He could not be. But he carried Copper's blood somewhere in his bones, some wandering line of loyalty that had crossed roads, hunger, cruelty, and floodwater to return to the porch of the woman who had once watched her son disappear. Maggie pressed both hands over her mouth, but the sob came through anyway. Rusty rose, limped forward, and placed his muddy head against her chest. She held him then, not as a stray, not as a bargain bought with silver earrings, but as a message delivered late by the hard, humorous mercy of heaven. She had given up the last shining relic of her past to save him, and he had brought back something brighter. Proof that love did not die simply because it lost the road. Sometimes it wandered for years, hungry, scarred, and growling at its own reflection. Sometimes it arrived with fleas, bad manners, and a dramatic opinion about sandwich wrappers. But if grace was real, then maybe it had paws. Maybe it could swim through black water. Maybe one day it could find its way home. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive with thunder, golden light, or angels standing in the sky. Sometimes it arrives wet, hungry, frightened, and covered in mud. Sometimes it has scarred paws, torn ears, and a heart that has been hurt so badly it almost forgot how to trust. Maggie thought she was saving a stray dog
Rusty.
when she gave up the last
Come on,
silver
boy, you can
memory
do
of
it.
her husband. But in the end, God used that broken little creature to save her grandson, guide rescuers through the flood, and return a lost piece of her family's past. Rusty was not just a dog. He was a reminder that love may disappear for a season, but it is never truly lost when God has not finished writing the story. In our daily lives, we often meet people, and even animals, who seem too damaged, too angry, or too far gone to be saved. But kindness can become a doorway. Mercy can become a raft. And one small act of love, given when we have almost nothing left, can return to us as a blessing greater than anything we sacrificed. So if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us about an animal, a person, or a moment that reminded you God still works in quiet and unexpected ways. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles hidden inside ordinary lives. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide every lost heart safely home.